Thank you so much for having me this morning. I'm glad we're finally getting here to spend some time with you to share about the Christian Children's Home of Ohio. I'm going to give you a quick overview before I hop into the message. Christian Children's Home has three primary ministries that we're known for. Our Encompass Christian Counseling, and we have offices from about Mansfield area to east of Akron-Canton up towards Cleveland. And we do counseling not only for children, but for adults. Then we also have Encourage Foster Care, which is, again, available pretty much in that same territory. We can send out workers and we can have families throughout that same area. And then what we're most known for is our residential campus in Worcester, Ohio at CCHO. And we can receive kids from anywhere in the state. So from Cincinnati to Cleveland to Toledo, down to Gallipolis, if you're familiar with that, and all points in between, we can receive children on our campus. And the difference between foster care and what we would receive on our campus, the kids on our campus have suffered a higher level of trauma than those who would be in a foster home. So just to give you a couple stories of kids who have come to us at the Christian Children's Home, one that has recently come to us, his story is, because I like to share stories with you, he is around 11 years old now. When he was a baby, he was put up for adoption. And then he was adopted by a family that, around the age of 10, decided they didn't want him anymore. And so they took him to the hospital and dropped him off. And when the hospital kept calling them, they said, "Quit calling us, we don't want him." So then he was put into a foster family. He started to bond very quickly with the foster mother, but then very quickly, sadly, she was diagnosed with cancer and was in the hospital. And during that time she was in the hospital, literally unspeakable things, and when I say unspeakable things, happened to this young boy while she was in the hospital, and that's when he came to us. With one of his first conversations with one of our staff members was this: "In about a month, you won't like me anymore." Now, think about his story and what he grew up with. It's kind of natural that's the message he has received in his young life. In about a month, you won't like me anymore. We had a teenage girl who came to us, and when she came, she was raised in a family that practiced in the occult. Yes, it really does happen. And so when she came to us, her phrase was, "I don't know if God is for real, because I've never seen God at work. But I know Satan's for real, because I've seen him at work." And so she was kind of difficult to deal with, as you might imagine, during her time with us. But over the course of the time, our staff continued to show her the love of God in spite of her behaviors. And as she saw our staff loving on her and loving on the other kids on our campus, she had what I call like an aha moment, like the light bulb went off over her head. And she said, for the first time, she is seeing God at work. And she ended up getting baptized during her time with us. And she not only got baptized, she became on fire for the Lord and became like a leader, spiritual leader in the teenage girls' cottage. So much so, the girls hated to see it when she finally was able to leave our campus and being placed into a home. So those are just a couple of the stories. I could tell you story after story of unspeakable things that our children have suffered through. And I think it's great that you're doing this to help the children through the Salvation Army, because I know in the case of our own kids' lives, it is powerful when somebody shows them love who they don't even know them. We have people who give gifts to our kids on campus. And one boy was so overwhelmed when there were gifts around on campus because he was not going to get any gifts in his own home. And just a matter of days before Christmas, he came to us. And we had someone on standby who quickly got him Christmas gifts. And he was so overwhelmed, teenage boy ran back to his room and barricaded himself in that room because that powerful statement of love was so much for him, he couldn't handle it. And so our team ended up ministering to him and explaining the love of Jesus to him, and that's what he was experiencing during that time. So it's great that you are doing something for kids in your community, because that has a powerful impact on children when a stranger is showing them love, when they may not have experienced or may not be experiencing it in their day-to-day lives. Well, today I'm going to be talking a little, and by the way, I do have pens and stuff out there. By all means, pick something up. We have our websites to all the different ministries I mentioned. I always forget to mention our table out there, so I suddenly remembered. Also, please pick up a pen, and it does have our website on it, but please pick up our pen, because in a few months from now, you're going to forget there's some bald guy who spent all this time getting my hair ready for you this morning to speak. You're going to forget all the things I'm sharing with you this morning. Not all the things, but you'll forget some of the things. But when you look at that pen, I want you to also remember to pray for our kids. As you've heard just a couple stories this morning, when you pick up that pen today, and you take that home, the next time you use it, it'll serve as a nice reminder for you just to pray. Take a quick moment and pray for the kids who come to us at the Christian Children's Home. I appreciate you doing that. Well, I'm going to be talking this morning about being a Jesus-first church. Now, of course, in order to be a Jesus-first church, we need to know who is Jesus, and what does that mean for us this morning. So let's look at Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, which reads, The Lord is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all this fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Let's highlight a few key phrases from that passage we just read so that we can clearly understand who Jesus is. First, we see in that passage that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. Now, I hear over and over again, and you probably have heard from people as well, who is God? Who is God? I don't know who God is, like it's some mystical force out there that we can't figure out. Who is God? Well, we just read in that passage, you want to know who God is? Look at who Jesus is. We see in the passages, we know historically who Jesus is. We know that he is the image of the invisible God. So there is no mystery about who God is. He has given us the example right in front of our eyes in Jesus. Now we go on to read in that passage, all things are created through and for him. The reality is we aren't on earth to live for ourselves. There is a higher purpose. He has given us a higher purpose. This is not the game of life. Some of you may remember the game of life. If you haven't ever played the game of life, it's been a long time since I played it, but as a child, I did. There's this big old circle, you spin the dial, and then you move so many spots in a little car, and you start by yourself in the car, and you spin the wheel, and you move down, and through the course of life, you add a spouse, you add children. The children never, mouth off to you either. That's the great thing. They just sit in the back of your car. You move through life, you get a job, you accumulate money, you buy a house, and at the end of the game of life, whoever has the most stuff wins. That is the game of life. And sadly, many of us in society today are living our lives like the game of life. Like that is what we're supposed to be doing. And we don't understand, why are we so frustrated right now? Well, we're frustrated because we're living with the wrong purpose. We're living it like it's a board game instead of with the purpose and plan that God has for your life. We are not pursuing that calling that he's designed you specifically for in your life. Think about that this morning. What that purpose is he has for your life. He is, we go on to see in this passage, that he is the head of the church. He leads us. The feet don't tell the body where to go. We kind of get that wrong. I was thinking about this the other day. We think that the feet is taking us in this direction or that direction, but that's not the case. The feet are following the orders from what's coming up here. My brain is telling my feet we are going in this direction. My head is telling me now, my feet, we're going over in that direction. And so we get it kind of messed up here of how that works. So the reality is when we say he is the head of the church, he, the head, is leading us. He also, in this passage, says he brings reconciliation to us and our Heavenly Father through his blood shed on the cross. It is only through the shed blood of Jesus that we can have a relationship with our Father. The very first step to being a Jesus-first church is having a relationship with our Heavenly Father. Otherwise, our actions are just based on religion or our desire to do good or trying to be a good person rather than having a relationship with our Heavenly Father. So now that we know who Jesus is, the next question is, how do we become a Jesus-first church? Okay, so first I would say this. If we are putting Jesus first, we must have his heart to love others even when it's hard. Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40 says this. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Now, you may be familiar with that passage. I know I've heard it many times, and it's pretty simply, if I was going to paraphrase it, it's love God, love others. That's really what that passage is saying. Love God, love others. So on the surface, that sounds pretty easy, right? We hear that first part. I mean, we are talking about the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords who saved my soul. What is not to love about God, right? That sounds kind of easy there. But then we get in that next part of the passage about loving our neighbor. Now things get a little bit more complicated, doesn't it? Some of you are thinking this morning about, you don't understand, Dan, and we start what this person has done, and we start to come up with loopholes. Now, what does it mean to be my neighbor? Does that count the guy 3 doors down from me? Is that my neighbor? Is the person whose desk is next to me, does that count as my neighbor? We start to try to come up with these loopholes to not have to really be challenged by that passage of loving our neighbor. Now, there are 3 ways of dealing with trauma. I'm going to share with you this because this is an example of loving even when it's hard. There are 3 common ways of dealing with trauma. We see this all the time on our campus, especially with kids. Fight, flight, and freeze are the 3 common ways of dealing with trauma. It's important for our staff to understand this because the kids will act out in these 3 ways. And on the surface, you would think, boy, that kid's just being difficult. But when you understand the 3 common ways of dealing with trauma, fight, flight, and freeze, it changes things. Fight is just what it sounds like. They will throw down on you for apparently no good reason. They can just throw. So that's a mechanism. Flight, just like it sounds like, they will take off. When I first came to the Christian Children's Home, I would come onto campus and I would see a staff member at the bottom of a tree. This would be a common thing. I knew what that meant, that there's a kid up that tree who is practicing that flight mechanism. They are just waiting to get away from everybody for a little while, and the staff member knows they can do that. I'll just wait for them because sooner or later they're going to want to eat or go to the bathroom. They're going to come down sooner or later on their own. So they're just going to wait it out at that point. And one of the cool things churches did through VBS's one year, they helped us buy a geodome, because I saw that a lot, and I said, what can we do to help with this flight mechanism? Geodome, if you don't know, I didn't know it was called. To me, it's just round monkey bars is what I would call it. And so the great thing about that is that it gave children a safer way than climbing a tree to climb on the monkey bars to get that flight mechanism. Or, I didn't know they were going to do this, but it turned out it made total sense to me once I saw it. Kids went inside the geodome, so they had this protective shell around them. It made so much sense once I saw them practicing it that way, that flight mechanism in action. They just went inside the geodome. So it's kind of cool to see that play out. So church has blessed us to be able to do that. So flight freeze is the other common way, and it could be like, you are talking to me, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, but I'm in my own little world at this time. I'm just kind of in my own place as you're trying to communicate with me. So common ways of dealing with trauma: fight, flight, and freeze. Now, one of our teenage boys did exactly what I told you about a moment ago. He just suddenly came up and punched one of our staff members and knocked him out. Now, I don't know about you, but my first response the next day might not be positive when I had to interact with that boy. But this staff member understood the 3 common ways of dealing with trauma. He knew this boy's history and the things that he has been through, and he went up to that boy and let him know that he was forgiven and that he understood what was going on in that boy's life, and that he cared for him, even though just the day before you decked me at that point. You see, there are no loopholes to love. Do you not think that that boy was transformed more by our staff member's response the next day than if he would have just done what most of us would have done and being hostile towards him for throwing that punch? A powerful moment in that young man's life. So even in those difficult moments, the reality is God's commands remain the same. The reality is Luke chapter 6, verse 32 speaks to this. It says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. It's easy to love people who love us, and a lot of times that's what we think about in loving and expressing our love for others. Where we're really challenged is to love with no loopholes, even when it's hard. Number 2, a Jesus-first church must go when he says go. Have you ever been at a traffic light? We've all been at a traffic light. And it turns green, and there's someone in front of you, and they're just sitting there. They're just sitting there. And the first second goes by, and you're loving them with the love of Jesus at that moment. the second goes by, and then all of a sudden, you need to let your opinion be known. And your hands find the horn at various degrees. Some of you are the hard honkers, at the people. Some of you are trying to be real nice, go, honk. Light turn green. That's what you're like doing, right? A little honk. Some of you are sitting behind. You don't do the honk, but you're questioning the mental sanity of the person who is in front of you during that time, right? We all had those moments because we all know this, right? When the light turns green, you go, right? We all know that. We all know that. So why are they not going? We all know to go when the light turns green. But then think about this. When God says go, we often hesitate, right? We start to treat God telling us to go like he's the caution light. He's the yellow light rather than the green light. And we start to say things like, well, wait a second, I need to think about this for a little while, God. We're going to need to process this through. Well, look at how the disciples responded in Mark chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. That's Mark chapter 1, 16 through 18. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once, they left their nets and followed him. You see, they didn't stop and consult with 5 of their friends. Like, I believe God's calling me to do this, but I have to talk to 5 of my friends first before I can determine if it's okay if I go and do what God is laying on my heart. They didn't do that. They didn't say, but fishing is how we make a living, and then begin this conversation with Jesus as if he needed to convince them to give up fishing and following him. They left at once. They dropped everything. One of our staff members came to us from Texas. She was praying that the Lord would show her where to go. And she came across our website. And she felt like God was saying, you're going up to Worcester, Ohio, of all places. Not even a big city in Ohio. She's going to Worcester, Ohio, to work at the Christian Children's Home. She felt called to come. Now, her mom had other ideas, as you might imagine, for a while. But she still chose to pursue what God placed on her heart to do. And she's with us. You see, she understands this premise. When God talks, we don't talk back like we're a 7-year-old. We've all seen this. 7-year-olds talking back to parents, right? But Dad, but Mom, having that moment. And in a way, we can be that with God. We may not have that whiny tone that the 7-year-old has, but basically we're doing something similar, right? We're saying, but God, I can't do this because. We sound very rational in our discussions with God instead of whiny. You don't understand, God, I cannot do this because. And we'll reel off a list of reasons why we can't do what God is calling us to do, as if he doesn't know any of those issues that we just brought up to him in those conversations, right? You see, God is looking for your availability, and then you need to trust him to provide you with those details, the abilities to do that, which God has called you to do. We tend to get that in reverse, right? When we're having those conversations with God about what he's laying on our heart to do, and we're saying, but God, you don't understand, blah, 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 blah. He's saying, no, you got that in reverse. I'm saying to do. I'm calling you to do this. Trust me with all that other stuff. You don't need to be figuring out all this other stuff. I got it. I understand it. I know the obstacles. I know the struggles. And by the way, God knows a few things that you don't even know you're going to come across along the way, because it might scare you from doing that which God has called you to do. So he reveals certain things later down the path. So he already knows that. He's looking for your availability, and then it's up to us to say, okay, I'll go. It's a green light. And then I'm going to trust you, God. I'm going to hold you to be true to your word and provide that which I need to do that which you're calling me to do. Remember, the power and provision of God has not diminished over the years. In Matthew chapter 14, we see how Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then in the very next chapter, Matthew chapter 15, Matthew 15, we read that he then fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves and a few small fish. So basically, they had a little more food in the second passage there, in Matthew 15, a little more food and fewer people to feed. But the disciples still, in verse 13, asked this. They were like, where are we going to get enough bread in this remote location to feed all these people? Now, when I read that, I'm like, really, disciples? Did you just have amnesia? What is going on with y'all? Just the chapter before, he fed more people with less food, and here you are, one chapter later. Of course, there's time, but still, it's not that long ago. You experienced this incredible miracle, and while still a miracle, it's less of a miracle than what you've already experienced, and you're like, you act like you've never seen Jesus move in that moment before. But how many times do we do the same thing? How many times have I caught myself forgetting how God has provided for me? It is so important. Maybe you literally have to write down those moments of victory in your life to remind you of those times of provision. We've all gone through hard times in life. It is part of life. But God, time after time after time, provides for us. And it's so important that I remember, once I get over here, what happened back there, because when I remember what God did for me back there, I can be more confident in him taking care of the today and the tomorrow, because I've seen him move in my life before, and I won't forget the feeding of the 5,000, so to speak. I want to share with you, the reality is, I do want to share as I go into the story from one of our staff members. She wrote up for me here. God has provided for us time and time again. And so we need to remember that as we are called to do the next big thing. And that's what this staff member talks about here. I'm just going to read her story. She says, I had just earned a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Malone College and was applying for nursing jobs close to home. One Sunday morning, Gary Porter, he was the head of Christian Children's Home for a very long time, he's executive director, he spoke at her church about the mission, much like I'm doing, growth and needs of CCHO. I had never heard about CCHO, but I felt a tugging in my spirit that day. The thought of working at a Christian agency and being able to help kids who were abused, neglected, and forgotten about seemed like something I was supposed to do. I prayed about my future career, that God would clearly guide my path. I felt led to apply at CCHO, but I also applied to local hospitals and doctor's offices. Calls and emails started coming in for interviews, including one with CCHO. When I pulled onto campus, I felt an overwhelming peace and comfort that I cannot explain. My interview felt so comfortable and natural, like I'd known these people forever. You could sense the Holy Spirit in the room as we discussed the demands of the job, and if I was sure I could handle being cussed at, targeted, assaulted, and pushed away. As alarming as that sounded, I knew that God would give me what I needed if this is where I was supposed to be. I was offered a job before I left, but explained that I had some other interviews lined up before making a decision. I left feeling excited and energized as I headed to my next interview at the hospital. This interview went very differently. The HR representative asked basic questions. I felt anxious and almost queasy. She stopped asking work-related questions and explained that she was a God-fearing woman who was perceptive to the Holy Spirit. She asked me if I had other job opportunities to consider. I explained that I had literally just come from my CCHO interview. She observed that my demeanor and presence lit up when I started talking about CCHO. She explained that the spiritual tension had never shown up in an interview before, but that she felt like God needed me in the mental health field at CCHO. She prayed with me and told me that she would hire me in a heartbeat if I wanted to work at the hospital, but she wanted me to prayerfully consider this decision. I left there in disbelief. Did that just happen? I prayed that whole weekend about what to do. Over and over, God confirmed that I need to stop questioning him and join the mission field at CCHO. It was not a popular decision among family and friends. They didn't understand why I would waste my nursing degree and take a job at a much lower starting wage. I ignored the criticism and accepted the direct care position at CCHO. For the last 10 years, I have had a front row seat to watching miracles happen. Some of the most depressed, isolated, closed-off children and teenagers have learned to see their value, believe they are loved, and develop the capacity to love and trust others, all because their difficult journey in life brought them to CCHO. You see, when God gives you the green light, the Jesus First Church goes. 3, a Jesus First Church serves. In John chapter 13, Jesus washes the disciples' feet, and he says in verses 14 and 15, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Now, can you imagine washing someone's feet? It's a pretty humbling thing, right? But Jesus did it. So is that task, that mission that he has called you to, really beneath you? When you consider that he was willing to wash people's feet? On one cold winter night, one of our younger residents was outside the cottage, and she was yelling at the staff, I don't want you to love me. She went back and forth from screaming to sobbing, and eventually she laid outside on the cold pavement just crying. Then one of our staff members laid down beside her. And gradually the sobbing stopped as the two of them laid on that pavement together. You see, that moment, and I think you can all just picture that, right? the screaming little girl laying down, and then the adult coming and laying right beside her, maybe caressing her hair a little bit, calming her down. In that moment, it's just a picture of Christ's love in action. What a humbling moment that is. Laying on the outside pavement. It was cold that day. Matter of fact, some staff members ended up getting them blankets. It was so cold to be laying out there on the pavement so they wouldn't freeze out there. That is a picture of humble service. A Jesus First Church serves. 4, a Jesus First Church does not stand on the sidelines. We are a people of action. We know that faith without works is dead. James chapter 2, verse 26 talks about that. Colossians 3, verses 23 through and 24 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Now you may be wondering, as I've been talking about what is God calling you to do, you may be wondering, what is God calling me to do? I don't know. So here's my first question to help you with that. Is what has God given you a passion for? What has God given you a passion for? When you read a headline, or you see something happening, or you hear about something on the news or the radio, that you just say to yourself, something has got to be done about this. Someone needs to get involved and resolve whatever that issue that's got your attention. You see, that's a sign that you're passionate about that issue, and perhaps that's what God is calling you to get involved in. Now, here's the thing, too, is it's different for all of us. For me, I did work in radio for about 25 years, different locations. But then he began to speak to my heart about children. I was watching, in Christian radio, you go to concerts all the time. It's the contemporary Christian music stations predominantly I work for. So you go to concerts all the time, and you see about helping children overseas. And children overseas needing help, and children overseas needing help. And what I felt like God was speaking to me is that there are kids right here in this country that are needing help. And so I began to pursue, what does that mean for me at this stage in my life? And then I began to learn more and more. I see over 18,000 children in the state of Ohio, 18,000 children in the state who are in the foster care system. Smithville, where I grew up in, is about 2,000 people. That's 9 Smithvilles filled with kids that are in the foster care system. To me, I say, when I hear about these children, many abused and neglected, I say someone has to help these children. Someone has to care about these kids. So I apply for grants because while we do get some government funding, my job is to raise money to help the ministry to go on. And thank you as a church for being one of our supporting ministries. We have individuals, we have churches, we have businesses, we have grants that we apply for. And when I'm applying for grants, I'm always shocked when we don't get the money. Because my response is, you don't understand how important this issue is. They must be missing something. But then I realize that their hearts are for another very worthy cause. That's where their passion is at. It's just not the same passion as what mine is. Perhaps someone in the row that you are sitting in this morning, in the pew that you are sitting in, they may have a passion for something different than you. You may just assume because you have this passion, everybody has that passion, and it isn't the case. That goes back to that calling that I was saying. There's a specific reason you care so much about this. But the other people in your row, God has placed a different passion. and a different passion and a different passion. And that's what they're called to be working on. So maybe someone in your row has a passion for overseas missions. Maybe someone in your row has a passion for the homeless. Maybe someone in your row simply has a passion for sending out a card to people when they're going through a hard time. Maybe someone in your row has a passion for organizing meals for a family that has just suffered a loss. Or maybe someone's in the hospital and the rest of the family is needing fed, and that's their passion. There are so many different passions out there. And we may not share the same passions in our hearts, but I do know this, that a Jesus-first church does not stand on the sidelines. A Jesus-first church says we will not forget the needs of society, whether it be in our community or around the world. We will be a Jesus-first church that loves when it's hard, goes when God says go, serves others, and does not stand on the sidelines.